Debunking 10 common stereotypes about Africa. There are so many myths and stereotypes about Africans that are commonplace in the West. Here are 10 of them. Number 10. Africa is a country. One of the most common misconceptions in the West is that Africa is a single homogeneous country. In reality, Africa is a vast continent with diverse nations and cultures. As the second largest continent on Earth, Africa is a diverse and culturally rich landmass that encompasses 54 recognized countries, over 2,000 distinct languages, and countless ethnic groups. Despite this outstanding diversity, a persistent and harmful stereotype continues to plague Africa: the misconception that Africa is a single homogeneous country. This stereotype oversimplifies a complex and multifaceted continent, perpetuates ignorance, and neglects the incredible diversity that exists within Africa. The stereotype that Africa is a country has deep historical roots, dating back to the colonial era when European powers divided the continent among themselves. During the scramble for Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European colonialists carved up the continent into arbitrary borders that paid little heed to the existing cultural, ethnic, and linguistic boundaries of the indigenous peoples. This act of colonialism created a skewed perception of Africa as a monolithic entity, a misconception that still persists today. Media, particularly in Western countries, have also played a significant role in perpetuating this stereotype. Many movies, news reports, and educational materials have presented Africa as a single entity with homogeneous culture and landscapes, rather than highlighting the rich diversity that characterizes the continent. This stereotype leads to a profound lack of understanding about Africa's true complexity. It ignores the vast differences in culture, language, and traditions that exist among African nations. Ignorance, in turn, can perpetuate negative stereotypes about Africa, its people, and its potential. Treating Africa as a single entity oversimplifies the challenges and opportunities present across the continent. Each African nation faces its unique set of political, economic, and social issues, and a one-size-fits-all approach is ineffective and counterproductive. Misconceptions about Africa can deter investment, trade, and development efforts. When Africa is perceived as a single impoverished entity, potential investors and donors may overlook promising opportunities for growth and progress in individual countries. The stereotype of Africa as a country has led to the harmful practice of cultural appropriation. People from outside the continent often generalize African cultures, using them as fashion trends or art forms without understanding or respecting their significance. This stereotype can lead to a lack of international attention or action on critical issues, such as human rights abuses or humanitarian crises. In specific African countries, the global community may be less inclined to intervene when they perceive Africa as a single homogeneous entity. To foster greater understanding and appreciation of Africa's rich diversity, it is essential to challenge and dispel this stereotype. By promoting accurate education, responsible media representation, and cultural exchange, we can replace this harmful misconception with a more nuanced and respectful perspective on Africa, its people, and its many distinct nations. Africa is not a country. It is a continent with a kaleidoscope of cultures, histories, and opportunities waiting to be explored and understood. Number 9. Lack of education. One of the common stereotypes about Africa is that there are no schools, therefore the people are not educated. But Africa has a growing education system with many well-established universities and research institutions. Not all Africans lack access to quality education. The myth that Africans are not educated is a deeply entrenched stereotype that has persisted for centuries. It is a harmful and inaccurate generalization that has perpetuated misconceptions about the educational achievements and capabilities of the diverse people of Africa. Contrary to the myth, Africa has a long and illustrious history of education that predates colonialism. Many ancient African civilizations such as Egypt, Mali, and Aksum had established educational systems. In Egypt, for example, the Great Library of Alexandria was a renowned center of learning, housing a vast collection of knowledge from across the ancient world. African societies often emphasized the importance of oral traditions, where knowledge, history, and cultural values were passed down through storytelling, proverbs, and rituals. This form of education was integral to the social fabric of many African communities. The myth of uneducated Africans gained momentum during the colonial era when European powers sought to dominate and exploit African nations. Colonialists often imposed their educational systems on African societies with an emphasis on European languages and culture. This disrupted traditional African educational practices and contributed to the misconception that Africans were inherently uneducated. However, resistance to colonial education was also significant. African leaders and intellectuals like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Julius Nyerere advocated for the decolonization of education and the promotion of indigenous knowledge systems. These efforts laid the foundation for modern African educational systems. In the post-independence era, African countries have made substantial progress in education. Governments across the continent have invested in building schools, universities, and technical institutions. Access to education has increased and literacy rates have steadily improved. Moreover, African nations have developed their curricula incorporating both traditional knowledge and modern subjects. African scholars have made significant contributions to various academic fields, including science, medicine, engineering, literature, and the arts. For instance, Wole Soyinka, a Nigerian playwright and poet, received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1986. Dr. Calastrus Juma, a Kenyan scientist, was a renowned expert in agricultural biotechnology. These individuals are just a few examples of the many accomplished Africans who have made their mark in academia. African scholars and professionals are not limited to their continent. They have also been active participants in international academic and research collaborations. Many Africans have pursued advanced degrees at prestigious universities worldwide and have returned home to contribute to the development of their countries. Additionally, African nations have formed partnerships with foreign universities and research institutions to address global challenges such as climate change, health, and technology. The myth that Africans are not educated is a deeply flawed and outdated stereotype that fails to recognize the rich history of education in Africa, the progress made in modern education, and the significant contributions of African scholars on the global stage. Education is a fundamental human right and a critical driver of progress and development, and Africans are not exception in their pursuit of knowledge and advancement. It is essential to challenge and dispel such myths to promote a more accurate and inclusive understanding of the continent and its people. Number 8. Dependency on the West. One of the common myths is that African countries cannot survive without Western aid, that Africa heavily relies on foreign aid, but not all African countries are dependent on foreign aid. Some nations have strong economies and trade relationships. The belief that Africa is heavily dependent on the West for its economic, social, and political stability is a myth. While it is true that Africa has had historical and contemporary interactions with Western countries, the notion that Africa is entirely reliant on the West exemplifies a complex relationship. To understand the stereotype, it is essential to delve into the historical context of Africa's relationship with the West. The colonial era, spanning from the late 19th century to the mid-20th century, saw European powers carving up the African continent. Colonialism brought exploitation, the displacement of indigenous cultures, and the extraction of resources for the benefit of European colonial powers. This legacy has contributed to the perception of Africa as a continent perpetually in need of Western intervention. One of the key aspects of Africa's relationship with the West is the economy. Africa has rich natural resources, and Western countries have historically played a role in exploiting these resources. However, it is crucial to recognize that African nations are increasingly asserting their sovereignty and renegotiating resources extraction agreements. Countries like Nigeria and South Africa have diversified their economies and developed stronger trade partnerships with various regions, including Asia. African entrepreneurs and businesses are thriving both within the continent and internationally. The tech industry in countries like Nigeria and Kenya is gaining global recognition, illustrating that Africa is not solely dependent on Western investment. Foreign aid is often cited as evidence of Africa's dependence on the West. While it is true that many African nations received aid, it is essential to understand the nuances of this relationship. Aid can be a vital lifeline for countries facing humanitarian crises, but it is not a sustainable long-term solution. African governments and organizations are increasingly focused on creating self-reliance and sustainable development rather than perpetual aid dependency. Initiatives like the African Union Agenda 2063 emphasize African ownership of development processes. Africa's political relationships with the West are complex. While some Western countries have been involved in African conflicts or supported authoritarian regimes, others have played roles in peacekeeping and supporting democratic transitions. African nations have shown agency in shaping their political destinies, often through regional organizations like the African Union. The stereotype that Africa depends entirely on the West oversimplifies the intricate relationship between the two. Africa's historical experiences, economic endeavors, and political development demonstrate that it is not a passive recipient of Western aid or influence. African nations are actively working to diversify their economies, promote self-reliance, and shape their political futures. It is essential to recognize Africa's agency and the strides it has made in asserting its independence from historical legacies of colonialism and exploitation. Africa is a continent with immense potential and a bright future, shaped by its own decisions and actions rather than dependency on external forces. Number 7. All African leaders are corrupt. One of the commonly perpetrated myths about Africa is that all its leaders are corrupt and therefore not trustworthy. This myth has been perpetrated by Africans themselves and their counterparts in the West and elsewhere. The myth that all African leaders are corrupt is a damaging stereotype that has persisted for decades, perpetrated by a combination of misinformation, bias, and historical factors. While it is undeniable that corruption exists in various parts of Africa, it is essential to recognize that painting all African leaders with the same brush is both unfair and inaccurate. To debunk the myth of universal corruption among African leaders, one need only look at the numerous examples of principled leaders who have made substantial contributions to their countries. One such leader is Nelson Mandela, the iconic former president of South Africa. Mandela's unwavering commitment to justice, reconciliation, and equality exemplifies a leader who stood against corruption and worked tirelessly to transform his nation. Another notable example is Julius Nyerere, the founding father of Tanzania. Nyerere's selfless dedication to social justice and economic development earned him the respect of many across Africa. His efforts to create a more equitable society are a testament to the fact that not all African leaders are driven by corrupt motives. It is crucial to acknowledge that corruption is a global issue, not limited to any specific region or continent. Corruption arises from a combination of factors, including historical legacies, economic disparities, weak institutions, and political instability. African countries have faced unique historical challenges, such as colonialism, which has left lasting scars on their institutions and economies. Corruption often thrives in environments where institutions are weak and there is a lack of transparency and accountability. Rather than attributing corruption solely to African leaders, it is essential to consider these systemic factors that contribute to corruption in many parts of the world. Africa is a continent with diverse cultures, languages, and political systems. It is not accurate to generalize about African leaders based on the actions of a few. The leadership landscape in Africa is incredibly diverse, and leaders who have pursued different paths and ideologies. Such have been successful in addressing corruption, while others have struggled. Leaders such as Paul Kagame of Rwanda and John Magufuli of Tanzania have taken strong measures to combat corruption within their respective countries. These leaders have shown that principled leadership and anti-corruption efforts can yield positive results. Number 6. Everyone is poor. Africa is often portrayed as a continent of extreme poverty and suffering. While there are impoverished areas, there are also thriving cities and economies. A persistent stereotype that continues to plague Africa is the assumption that everyone on the continent is poor. The oversimplified narrative not only fails to capture the complexity of African societies, but also perpetuates harmful stereotypes that hinder progress and mutual understanding. While it is true that some African nations face significant economic challenges, it is misleading and unfair to suggest that every person on the continent is living in poverty. Africa's economic landscape is as diverse as its geography, with nations experiencing varying levels of prosperity and development. Countries such as Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya have vibrant economies boasting thriving industries and a growing middle class. In contrast, some nations do struggle with poverty, largely due to historical legacies of colonization, conflict, and governance issues. The media often focuses on the most extreme examples of poverty and hardship in Africa, perpetrating stereotypes of destitution. While these stories are important, they do not represent the entire continent's reality. Many people have limited knowledge of Africa's diverse cultures, economies, and societies, leading to generalized assumptions about the continent's poverty. Africa's history of colonization and exploitation has had lasting effects on its development, making it vulnerable to economic challenges. Africa is not a monolithic entity defined solely by poverty. It is a continent of remarkable diversity with a wide range of economic, social, and cultural realities. The stereotype that everyone in Africa is poor not only oversimplifies the complex picture of the continent but also perpetrates harmful biases. It is essential to challenge this stereotype through education, media representation, and a nuanced understanding of Africa's diverse experiences. By doing so, we can move towards a more accurate and emphatic perception of this extraordinary continent and its people. Number 5. Africa is infested with tribalistic conflict. While conflict exists in some regions, it's inaccurate to stereotype all Africans as living in perpetual tribal warfare. Many African nations have peaceful societies and governments. Africa, often depicted as a continent riddled with tribalistic conflicts, has long been the victim of a damaging stereotype that oversimplifies the complex realities of the diverse nations within its borders. While Africa is home to a rich tapestry of cultures, entities, and languages, it is imperative to recognize that tribalism does not universally define its social and political landscapes. Africa is arguably the most culturally diverse continent on the planet. It comprises 54 recognized countries, each with its own unique blend of ethnic groups, languages, religions, and traditions. While some African countries do experience inter-ethnic tensions or conflict, it is a gross oversimplification to attribute this issue solely to tribalism. In many instances, historical, economic, and political factors play pivotal roles in this conflict. Colonialism left an indelible mark on Africa, artificially carving up the continent into arbitrary borders that often disregarded existing ethnic, cultural, and linguistic boundaries. This legacy of colonialism has contributed to the complexity of Africa's socio-political landscape. Conflict and tension between different ethnic groups are often rooted in the historical injustices of colonial rule and the struggle for control over newly drawn borders. Economic disparities and resource allocation are major drivers of conflict in many African nations. Competing interests over valuable resources such as land, minerals, and oil can exacerbate tensions between different groups. These conflicts are primarily driven by economic factors rather than tribalism. Additionally, poverty and lack of access to basic services can further contribute to instability, irrespective of tribal affiliations. Political leaders and institutions also play a significant role in fueling or mitigating ethnic tensions. Some African leaders have exploited tribal divisions to consolidate power, using patronage, networks, and favoritism towards their own ethnic groups. In contrast, effective governance and inclusive political systems can promote unity and reduce tribalistic conflict. Contrary to the myth of constant tribalistic conflict, Africa has numerous examples of nations and regions that have successfully promoted unity and cooperation among diverse ethnic groups. The East African Community, EAC, consisting of Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, demonstrate how countries with diverse ethnic compositions can work together for mutual benefit and development. The myth that Africa is infested with tribalistic conflict is a harmful oversimplification of the continent's complex realities. While inter-ethnic tensions do exist in some African countries, attributing these conflicts solely to tribalism oversimplifies the intricate web of historical, economic, and political factors at play. Africa's rich cultural diversity should be celebrated, and efforts should be made to address the root causes of conflict rather than perpetuating stereotypes. As the continent continues to evolve and develop, there is hope for greater unity, cooperation, and prosperity across its diverse nations. Number 4. Primitive technology. Some people wrongly believe that Africans lack access to modern technology and lack in primitive conditions. But many African countries have advanced infrastructure and technology. Africa has a history of remarkable technological achievement dating back thousands of years. One of the most well-known examples is ancient Egypt. The Egyptians built the pyramid using advanced engineering techniques that include precise geometry and mathematics. They developed an early form of writing known as hieroglyphics and invented sophisticated tools and construction methods. The kingdom of Aksum, in what is now Ethiopia, thrived around the 4th to 7th centuries AD and had a flourishing civilization with advanced agricultural practices, impressive architecture, and a written script. They often created their own currency and had a complex trade network. In West Africa, the Mali Empire, particularly during the reign of Mansa Musa in the 14th century, was one of the world's wealthiest and most advanced civilizations. They had a well-structured economy, advanced metallurgy, and renowned center of learning in Timbuktu, where scholars from around the world gathered to exchange knowledge. These historical examples demonstrate that Africa was far from technologically primitive. It had thriving societies with advanced technology and knowledge that contribute to global advancement. In the contemporary era, Africa is experiencing a technological renaissance. African nations are making significant strides in various fields, including information technology, telecommunications, agriculture, and healthcare. African countries have embraced the digital age with enthusiasm. They have rapidly expanded their internet infrastructure and smartphone penetration. Startups and tech hubs have emerged across the continent, creating innovative solutions for local and global challenges. Nigeria, for example, has a booming tech industry known as Niger Tech, which is gaining international recognition for its entrepreneurship. Africa is using technology to transform its agricultural sector. Innovations such as mobile apps for weather forecasting and market information are helping farmers make informed decisions. Additionally, precision agricultural techniques are increasing crops yield and food security. Telemedicine and mobile health apps are expanding access to healthcare services, especially in remote areas. African scientists and researchers are also contributing to global healthcare initiatives and drug discovery. Number 3. There are animals everywhere. While Africa is known for its rich wildlife and safaris, not all Africans live alongside wild animals. The portrayal of Africans in daily contact with wildlife is a stereotype. Africa is often romanticized as a continent teeming with wildlife, where every corner of the vast landscape is inhabited by exotic creatures. This romanticized image has been perpetrated through documentaries, travel brochures, and media coverage, creating a myth that there is abundant wildlife everywhere in Africa. However, it is essential to debunk this myth and recognize the complexities of wildlife distribution on the continent. Africa's biodiversity is indeed rich, but it is not uniformly distributed across its diverse ecosystem. Africa's vast and varied landscape encompasses a wide range of ecosystems, from arid deserts to lush rainforests, grassy savannas to mountainous terrains. While some of these ecosystems are indeed rich in wildlife, others are sparsely populated. The distribution of wildlife is closely tied to these ecosystems, and not all regions can sustain large populations of animals. One of the primary reasons for the uneven distribution of wildlife in Africa is human impact. Human activities, including deforestation, urbanization, agriculture, and poaching, have significantly affected wildlife populations. As human populations grow and encroach upon natural habitats, wildlife habitat loss becomes a pressing issue. Large cities, industrial zones, and farmland often displace wildlife, making it challenging for certain species to survive. While some areas of Africa have thriving wildlife populations, they are often concentrated within designated protected areas such as national parks and wildlife reserves. These protected areas, such as sanctuaries for endangered species and crucial breeding grounds for many animals. Outside of these reserves, the wildlife population may be severely diminished or even absent. Climate variability and extreme conditions also play a significant role in wildlife distribution. In arid regions like the Sahara Desert, for instance, the harsh conditions limit the number of variety of species that can survive. Extreme climates such as those in the Sahara or the Kalahari challenge even the hardest of animals, leading to low population densities. In regions where human population overlap with wildlife habitat, human-wildlife conflict becomes a significant issue. Animals that venture into populated areas such as elephants or big cats are often seen as threats and are sometimes killed or relocated. This conflict can result in the reduction of wildlife population in areas near human settlements. Even within ecosystems conducive to wildlife, not all species are uniformly distributed. Some animals are territorial and have specific habitat requirements, making their population patchy and localized. For instance, cheetahs prefer open grassland, while gorillas inhabit dense rainforests. These specific habitat preferences create variations in the distribution of different species. While Africa is undoubtedly home to a remarkable diversity of wildlife, the myth of abundant wildlife everywhere across the continent is far from accurate. Africa's ecosystems are highly varied, and the distribution of wildlife is intricately tied to these ecosystems, human impact, climate conditions, and species-specific preferences. Acknowledging the complexities of wildlife distribution in Africa is crucial for effective conservation efforts. To preserve and protect Africa's rich biodiversity, we must focus on conserving and restoring critical habitats, mitigating human-wildlife conflict, and supporting sustainable development that considers the needs of both humans and wildlife. Debunking the myth of universal wildlife abundance in Africa allows us to address these challenges more effectively and ensure the long-term survival of the continent's unique and valuable species. Number 2. Africa is unsafe. Africa is often portrayed as a dangerous place to be, a place where foreigners will be endangering their lives to visit. The pervasive and unfounded stereotype that portrays Africa as a uniformly dangerous and unsafe place to visit or live in is dangerous. While it is true that some regions face security challenges, it is essential to debunk the notion that everywhere in Africa is unsafe. Blanket statements about Africa's safety ignores the continent's vast variation in geography, political stability, and social dynamics. For example, countries like Mauritius and Seychelles, located in the Indian Ocean, consistently rank among the world's safest destinations. In contrast, areas facing turmoil, such as parts of the Sahel region or the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, require more cautious travel consideration. The diversity of safety conditions across the continent underscores the importance of considering specific regions rather than making generalizations. Contrary to popular belief, many places in Africa offer safe and enjoyable experiences for tourists and residents alike. Some of these destinations have developed robust tourism industries and are known for their safety records. African governments and international organizations are actively working to improve safety and security across the continent. Many African countries have invested heavily in their tourism infrastructure to ensure the safety and comfort of visitors. This includes well-maintained roads, modern airports, and a variety of accommodation options. Numerous African nations have made efforts to bolster their security forces to protect both residents and tourists. These efforts aim to deter criminal activity and address potential threats. African countries often collaborate with international organizations such as the United Nations and the African Union to promote peace and stability in the region. Peacekeeping missions and diplomatic negotiations have contributed to conflict resolution. Many local communities in Africa are actively involved in promoting tourism and ensuring the safety of visitors. Initiatives that encourage community engagement can lead to safer and more enriching travel experiences. Number 1. It is always hot in Africa. One of the commonest and laughable myths about Africa is that it is always hot. Africa, often depicted as a vast and unchanging land of relentless heat, is a continent with diverse climates that go beyond the stereotypical image of scorching desert and sweltering savannas. The misconception that Africa is always hot has persisted for centuries, perpetrated by media, literature, and limited geographical knowledge. Africa, the world's second largest continent, is characterized by its geographical diversity. It boasts an array of ecosystems ranging from arid desert to lush rainforests, expansive grassland to high mountain ranges. This geographical variety directly influences the continent's climate patterns, leading to significant differences in temperature, rainfall, and weather conditions. The Sahara Desert, often synonymous with the image of Africa as a perpetually hot continent, is the world's largest hot desert. While it is true that the Sahara experiences extreme heat during the day, the nighttime temperature can drop dramatically. Moreover, not all of Africa is desert, and many regions within the continent have entirely different climates. African savanna and grasslands, characterized by their extensive plains and moderate temperature, offer a stark contrast to the notion of constant heat. These regions experience distinct wet and dry seasons, with lush vegetation during the rainy season and cooler temperatures. Central and West Africa are home to some of the world's most extensive rainforests, where humidity and rainfall levels are exceptionally high. These environments are far from the arid heat often associated with Africa, presenting a different side of the continent's climate. North Africa, including countries like Morocco and Tunisia, experience a Mediterranean climate with mild, wet winters and hot, dry summers. This climate type is more akin to the weather experienced in parts of southern Europe, further debunking the myth of perpetual heat. Africa also boasts significant mountain ranges, such as the Atlas Mountain in North Africa and the Rwenzori Mountains in East Africa. These high-altitude areas can have significant cooler temperature, even featuring snow at their peaks. Africa's climate is far from the monolithic image of unending heat that has persisted for too long. It is a continent of climatic diversity with regions experiencing a wide range of temperatures, rainfall patterns, and weather conditions. Dispelling the false belief that Africa is always hot is not only a matter of accuracy, but also essential for fostering cultural understanding, supporting sustainable tourism, and addressing environmental and scientific challenges. Embracing the true climatic diversity of Africa is a step towards appreciating the continent in all its richness and complexity. There you have it, the 10 common myths and stereotypes about Africa. Let us know in the comments some of the stereotypes that you have heard about Africa. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay notified anytime we drop a hot new video covering an important aspect of Africa. We will see you next time.